I remember the hum of the conference room before anything else, that soft mechanical vibration that seemed to pulse through the glass walls as I stepped inside, pretending my hands were not shaking even though the tremor reached all the way up to my elbows. The air smelled faintly of cold metal and expensive cologne, nothing like the grease and dust I was used to, and, for a moment, I wondered if I even belonged in a place like this. My shoes left faint prints of melted slush on the polished floor, and I tried to swallow the lump rising in my throat. I told myself to keep moving, to breathe, to act like I had earned a place at this table, even if everything about my stiff thrift store shirt suggested otherwise. Two people were already there. A man in a navy suit flipping through a folder that looked thicker than my entire employment history, and a woman tapping briskly on a tablet. Neither of them looked up at me right away. I straightened my shoulders, forcing myself toward the chair across from them, thinking only about the interview I had spent months preparing for. My mind was a mess of memorized responses, technical explanations, and the desperate hope that this time maybe life would take a turn in my favor. Then the door behind them opened. She walked in with the kind of presence that changes the air pressure in a room, a quiet authority that demanded attention without raising its voice. Her heels clicked against the floor with calm precision. She wore a charcoal suit that fit her perfectly. Her dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested confidence rather than vanity. She did not see me immediately. She set her folder down, exchanged a brief acknowledgement with the man at the table, and finally turned. That was the moment everything inside me stopped. My breath caught mid-chest. The conference room around me blurred at the edges like someone had smeared the world with their thumb. Her eyes lifted and met mine, and in that instant I was no longer standing in a corporate high-rise. I was back on the shoulder of Highway 61, rain hitting my back and cold needles, my hands wrapped around a stubborn lug wrench while a stranded woman tried not to panic beside a car that cost more than my yearly income. It was her. The woman whose flat tire I had changed the morning before. The woman who had looked at me with genuine relief, her hair plastered to her cheeks from the storm. Her voice unsteady when she told me she had no idea what she would have done if I had not stopped. The woman I walked away from believing I would never see again. She froze just for a breath as recognition flickered in her eyes. It was a small movement, but enough to send heat rushing into my face. She masked it quickly, smoothing her expression into that poised, unreadable calm people in positions of power seem to perfect. But I had seen it. She knew exactly who I was. The man in the navy suit began speaking, introducing the panel, outlining the structure of the interview, but his voice came through like sound underwater, muffled and distant. All I could hear was the rapid pounding of my own heartbeat, loud enough that I wondered if anyone else noticed. I felt the cold bite of fear mixed with something deeper, something like disbelief. A stranger I had helped out of simple decency now stood here holding a folder that might contain the decision that determined my future. I did not know what it meant. I did not know why fate had decided to twist itself into this shape. I only knew one thing, as she slowly took her seat at the head of the table. Yesterday morning I thought I was just helping someone change a tire. I had no idea I was handing my life to the one person who had the power to change it forever. The day everything was supposed to change began long before the sun had fully lifted itself over the horizon, long before the world outside my small apartment stirred awake. I remember opening my eyes to the faint rattling of the old heating unit in the corner, the kind of sound you learn to sleep through only after years of living in buildings that were never truly warm. The ceiling above me glowed faintly with the gray light of early morning, and for a moment I lay still listening to the quiet of my home before the rush of reality hit me. Today was the day. The interview. The opportunity I had been chasing for months, maybe years, without saying it aloud. I rolled out of bed quietly so I would not wake my daughter Emma, who was curled up under a blanket covered in little blue stars. Her small hand rested near her cheek, her lips slightly parted, her breath soft and steady. Looking at her always made everything else feel heavier, and yet somehow more possible at the same time. I paused there in the doorway, thinking the same thought I had every morning: she deserved a steadier life than this. The apartment was a patchwork of what I could afford a thrift store kitchen table sitting crooked on uneven legs, mismatched chairs, a sagging couch I had picked up for free on a neighborhood app. The walls were thin enough that sometimes you could hear the neighbor's TV through them, and the window in the kitchen let in more draft than sunlight. But it was home. And today, if things went right, it could be the beginning of something better. I turned on the coffee maker, which sputtered and wheezed in protest before it agreed to brew enough for a single chipped mug. As it dripped, I stood at the counter, ironing a shirt that refused to look crisp no matter how much steam hissed out of the old iron. The collar was slightly frayed and the fabric had faded in patches, but it was the best I had. I picked up the navy tie I had bought for $3 at the thrift store downtown and looped it around my neck, trying to ignore how the thin fabric felt rough under my fingers. I practiced the knot twice, then 3 times, tightening it until it looked presentable. Presentable mattered today. I worked as a maintenance technician at an industrial complex just outside our small Midwestern town, a place where the winters bit hard and the summers baked everything in sight. Most of the machines there were older than I was and the hours were long, but it was honest work. Still, the paychecks kept us on the edge, always one unexpected bill away from falling behind. When I was younger, I thought hard work alone would build a better future. But after losing my wife, after raising Emma alone, after juggling bills I could barely keep track of, I realized hard work was just one part of the equation. Opportunity was the other. And opportunities rarely came walking toward people like me. Today's interview, though, felt like a door cracking open. I poured myself half a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter staring at the printed directions I had taped above the sink. I had memorized them already, but reading them again steadied me somehow. A job with North Star Manufacturing, better pay, health insurance that actually covered things, predictable hours. The promise of stability was a powerful thing. Emma shuffled into the kitchen, then rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, her hair a sleepy mess of tangles. She wore her favorite faded pink sweatshirt, the one with the peeling cartoon bear on the front. "Morning, Dad," she murmured, climbing onto one of the chairs. I slid a bowl toward her, filled with cereal that crackled when the milk hit it. She watched me adjust my tie in the reflection of the microwave door. "You look important today," she said, smiling through a yawn. I laughed softly, though my stomach twisted at the weight of the moment. I knelt beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I hope so, sweetheart." She poked at her cereal thoughtfully. "If you get the job, things will be easier, right?" The question hit harder than she knew. Or maybe she did know. Kids see more than we give them credit for. I nodded slowly. "I think so. Maybe a lot easier." She gave a tiny, satisfied nod, then kept eating, but the innocence of her question lingered in the air like a ghost. I finished gathering my things, slipping my worn wallet into my jacket pocket and checking for the folder holding my resume printed on paper slightly thinner than the kind offices usually use. When I reached the door, I turned back to Emma, who sat swinging her legs under the table. "Wish me luck, kiddo." She grinned and gave me both thumbs up. "You don't need luck. You're the smartest person in the world." I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the doorknob. If only the world worked that way. But her faith in me lit something in my chest, something warm enough to push back the cold dread I had been carrying all morning. I stepped outside into the gray, biting air. The sky was a dull sheet of clouds stretching endlessly above the town, the kind of sky that made it hard to tell where morning ended and winter began. My old truck waited at the curb, shivering slightly with the wind. Today was supposed to be the day everything changed. And, in a way it was. Just not in the way I thought. By the time I slid into the driver's seat of my old pickup, the dashboard clock glowed with numbers that made my pulse jump. I had planned everything down to the minute, waking up early, laying out clothes the night before, even mapping the route twice to avoid construction. But as the engine coughed itself awake and the heater sputtered out a thin stream of lukewarm air, I realized I was already cutting it closer than I liked. The interview was scheduled for 9. The drive on a good day took 25 minutes. Today was not looking like a good day. I pulled away from the curb, the truck rattling against the frozen pavement, and merged onto the main road. A blanket of gray hung over the entire town, dimming the streetlights that still flickered reluctantly. The houses looked half asleep, their windows fogged by the morning chill. I glanced at the clock again. 28 minutes. My heart thudded a little harder. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to steady the worry rising inside my chest. I had missed interviews before, not because I was careless, but because life had a cruel sense of timing. Once Emma woke up with a fever, and I had no one to watch her. Another time, my truck died at an intersection, and waiting for a tow cost me the only shot I had that month. Opportunities always seemed to slip through my fingers, not because I was incapable, but because I was always one problem short of stable. But this time had to be different. This time, I needed everything to go right. I checked the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of my tie crooked again. I reached up and straightened it with one hand, knowing it wouldn't make it look any less cheap. Still, I wanted to look like someone they could take seriously, someone who deserved a chance. As I turned onto Highway 61, the road stretched out before me like a promise, long and steady, flanked by bare trees that swayed gently in the wind. The heater finally warmed enough to push the cold from my fingers, and for the first time that morning, I felt a small surge of confidence. 23 minutes. Enough time. Enough to breathe. I tried to focus on the day ahead. I rehearsed potential questions in my head, mentally walking through technical terminology, imagining myself sitting across from people in pressed suits who had never crawled under a machine at 2 a.m. with oil dripping onto their sleeves. I wondered how to explain that my experience did not come from neatly formatted spreadsheets, but from years of trial error and doing whatever it took to keep old equipment running. Emma's voice echoed in my memory. "You're the smartest person in the world." I smiled at the windshield, even though the smile felt small and tight. I wished confidence worked the way she believed it did. 20 minutes. A thin layer of anxiety wrapped around my rib cage. My mind drifted to all the times I promised her things would get better, that I would find a way to give her more than this apartment with drafty windows and a father who was always one step behind. I could not fail today. Not again. I pushed the truck a little faster, feeling the engine protest under the strain. The wipers squeaked loudly across the windshield, struggling to push away the fine mist that had begun descending. The world blurred slightly around the edges, but I kept my eyes on the glowing lane markers ahead. 17 minutes. The road straightened, opening into a long stretch where fields brown and brittle from winter ran endlessly on either side. The sky looked heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. I glanced at the clock yet again, though I already knew the time. My stomach tightened as another thought hit me sharp and unwelcome. What if I got there on time, but froze in the interview? What if I stumbled through my answers or said something stupid? What if they saw right through me, saw the man who patched together a living with overtime shifts and second-hand tools? What if this chance slipped away like all the rest? My breath hitched. I forced myself to exhale slowly, gripping the wheel tighter. 14 minutes. The countdown felt louder than the engine, louder than the wind beating against the windows. I glanced at the photo taped to the dashboard, a snapshot of Emma holding a balloon at the county fair last summer. Her smile wide, her eyes bright. I touched the edge with my thumb. I whispered almost to myself, I have to make it. For her. For us. I never imagined that just minutes later, a single, unexpected moment on this quiet stretch of road would force me to choose between the future I'd been chasing and the man I believed myself to be. And I never imagined how that choice would change everything. I was just settling into a fragile sense of control when the moment that would break the day apart appeared like a crack forming across the windshield of my life. I spotted her from a distance first, a lone figure standing beside a sleek silver SUV pulled over on the narrow shoulder of Highway 61. The hazard lights blinked weakly against the gray morning, casting soft pulses of orange onto the wet pavement. At first, I barely registered the scene. People pulled over all the time. Engines overheated, drivers got lost, tires went flat. But then the image sharpened. Her posture wasn't casual, it was tense, almost folded in on itself. One hand clutched her phone, The other pressed her forehead as if she were fighting back frustration or maybe fear. The front left tire sagged against the rim like a wounded limb, black rubber shredded in uneven strips. A flat tire. Something so simple, so ordinary, but in that moment it looked like catastrophe for her. 13 minutes. That was all the time I had left. I glanced at the dashboard clock again, as if maybe it would change. Maybe it would give me back the minutes I had already spent rehearsing interview answers and straightening a thrift store tie in the reflection of a microwave door. I eased off the gas for only a second, barely enough to slow the truck, but enough for my heart to jolt. I could keep going. I could pretend I didn't see her. I could tell myself she'd already called for help. I could justify driving past her with the truth that the interview today wasn't a luxury. It was survival. It was Emma's future. It was everything. I pressed my foot lightly back onto the gas, intending to speed up again, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel, refusing to follow that decision. 11 minutes. If I stopped, I'd be late. If I was late, it was over. I knew that. The world wasn't kind to men like me who needed just one break. I stared ahead at the stretch of road still waiting for me, but my eyes kept drifting back to the mirror, watching the fading image of the woman standing alone with her broken-down SUV. She looked cold, lost, vulnerable in a way people rarely admit. Something twisted inside my chest, something that belonged not to logic, but to memory. My father's voice echoed so clearly it felt like he was sitting beside me again, his old flannel jacket smelling faintly of motor oil and peppermint gum. "Son, you don't drive past someone who needs help. Not ever." He used to say it while teaching me how to change a tire in our gravel driveway. The jack digging slightly into the loose stones, the sun warming our backs. He'd say it after he pulled over on snowy evenings to help strangers push their stranded cars out of ditches. He'd say it when he fixed things for neighbors without taking a dime, claiming the world runs smoother when people do good just because they can. After he died, those words felt like a compass I had inherited but never quite learned how to follow without fear. I gritted my teeth. 10 minutes now. I could almost hear my own heartbeat ticking in sync with the countdown. I pictured Emma sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me to come home that night, asking with hopeful eyes, "How did it go, Dad?" And I pictured myself having to explain to her that sometimes good men fall short, that sometimes even their best isn't enough. Then another image pushed through the fog in my mind, one that made my breath tighten. What if that woman were my sister? My mother? What if she were someone Emma would become someday, standing alone on a cold highway with no one stopping? What kind of world would I be teaching my daughter to expect if I chose to look away? 9 minutes. I slowed the truck again. My chest throbbed with conflict, the kind that hurts because both choices carry a price. I could feel the weight of every bill waiting at home, every disappointment I'd hidden from Emma, every bit of exhaustion etched into my body from years of hard work. If I failed today, part of me believed I would never recover from it. And yet, as I looked through the windshield at the woman now barely 30 yards behind me, I knew that driving away would leave a heavier scar. My father's voice pressed into me again, softer now, almost gentle. "Help when help is needed, son. That's the kind of man you are." I shut my eyes for half a second, feeling the decision settle over me like a cold rain. Then I pulled the truck onto the shoulder gravel, crunching beneath the tires. My heart dropped somewhere into my stomach as the dashboard clock blinked 8 minutes. I shifted into park, exhaling a breath that felt like surrender and resolve wrapped into one. As I opened the door, the wind slapped against my face and the cold rushed into my lungs so sharply I shivered. The woman looked up startled at first, then visibly relieved when she saw I was walking toward her. She dropped her phone to her side and exhaled in a breath I could see leave her in a pale mist. "Thank God," she murmured. I almost didn't think anyone would stop. I managed a small smile, though inside me something felt like it was cracking open. "I'm here now," I said quietly. "Let's see what we can do." And just like that, as simple and devastating as choosing to turn the wheel a few inches to the right, the entire course of my life shifted. I did not know then that helping her would cost me the interview. I did not know it would rebuild something inside me that had been broken for years. I did not know it would tie my fate to hers in the ways I could not yet understand. All I knew in that moment was that I had made my choice, the right one, the hard one, the one my father would have expected of me. And sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that change everything. The moment I stepped closer, the wind cut across the highway with such sharpness that it made the woman's hair whip across her face. She tucked it behind her ear with trembling fingers, her breath catching as she tried to offer me a steady smile. Up close, she looked even more shaken than she had from a distance. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her shoes more suited for an office hallway than a roadside emergency, and tiny flecks of mud dotted the hem of her slacks. She looked completely out of place out here, like a guest dropped into the wrong world. I crouched beside the shredded tire, letting my glove brush lightly across the rubber as I assessed how bad the damage was. The rim was bent slightly, and the tire itself looked as if it had exploded rather than gone flat. This wasn't something she could have fixed even if she had known what she was doing. She crouched down beside me without hesitation, her voice still unsteady. It made a loud noise, and then the whole car shook. I didn't know what to do. My jack is still in the truck, I said, standing again. I'll grab it. She nodded, folding her arms as another gust of wind pushed against her. I jogged back to my pickup, opened the tool chest in the bed, and grabbed the old jack that had belonged to my father. Its metal edges were worn smooth from years of use, and just touching it felt like a reminder of the man he'd been steady and dependable even in the smallest moments. When I returned, she had moved to stand slightly closer to the SUV, trying to block the wind from hitting her face. "Sorry about this," she said, her voice breathy with embarrassment. "I know you probably have somewhere to be." I swallowed hard at the irony of those words. "Yeah, I do," I admitted, lowering the jack, "but it's all right. Things happen." She studied me closely then, as if trying to piece together what kind of man would stop in the middle of a freezing morning to help a stranger. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker within hers, a mix of gratitude, worry, and something that looked very much like loneliness. I knelt again and placed the jack under the SUV, my fingers numbing instantly in the cold. As I began cranking it upward, the metal groaned softly, lifting the vehicle inch by inch. The woman crouched beside me and asked in a tentative voice, "Is it really that bad?" "Worse than a simple flat," I said. "But we can get you back on the road." She let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like relief. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. People have places to be. They don't usually slow down for someone like me." That made me pause. "Someone like you?" I raised an eyebrow. She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I mean someone who looks, well, put together. People assume I'll figure it out, or that I've already called someone who will fix it." She wasn't wrong. Most people would pass her without thinking twice, assuming help was already on the way. That was the strange thing about being visibly successful, or at least looking the part. People believed you had answers to everything, even when you didn't. I loosened the lug nuts with the wrench, the cold metal pressing painfully against my palm. She watched quietly for a moment, then said, "I don't know the first thing about cars. I probably shouldn't even be driving this thing on my own." "You're doing fine now," I said with a small smile. That earned a faint blush on her cheeks. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear again, a gesture I was beginning to recognize. When I pulled the ruined tire away and reached for the spare, she stood up quickly. "I have it in the trunk," she said, hurrying around the SUV. I followed her to the back as she struggled with the trunk hatch. It popped open and the cold air rushed inside, stirring the papers and tote bags scattered there. She reached for the spare tire, but I stopped her gently with a shake of my head. "Let me. It's heavy." She stepped aside, watching intently as I rolled the spare to the front of the car. As I worked, she finally spoke again, a little softer this time. "If you don't mind me asking, where were you headed before?" All this, I hesitated, tightening one of the lug nuts. "I have an interview today." She straightened immediately. "An interview for what? A maintenance position. Good company, good pay. It could really help me and my daughter. The moment I said it, I regretted how revealing it sounded, how vulnerable it made me feel. But something in her expression softened, as if those simple words had struck a chord inside her. "Do you think you'll make it on time?" she asked quietly. I paused again, meeting her gaze. "Probably not." She swallowed, guilt washing over her face so quickly it almost startled me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." I shook my head. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't choose for this to happen." She looked down her eyelashes, trembling slightly. "Most people wouldn't have stopped." "My dad wasn't most people," I said, standing again. "He taught me you don't leave someone stranded, even if it costs you." She took in a breath, watching me with a depth that made something inside my chest throb. "What's your name, Ryan?" I answered. "Ryan Hale." She repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Claire." "Thank you, Ryan. You probably saved my morning." I forced a small smile. Let's hope I didn't ruin mine. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but no words came. And in that quiet moment, with the cold wind swirling around us and the tire finally secure in place, neither of us could have imagined how deeply this small act of kindness would bind our lives together. By the time I tightened the last lug nut and lowered Claire's SUV back onto the cold pavement, my hands were aching from the cold, and my breath formed pale clouds in the air. Claire stood beside me. Her fingers knotted together. Her expression pulled tight with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She thanked me again, her voice soft, almost apologetic, but I brushed it off with a nod and stepped back toward my truck. When I opened the door, I glanced at the dashboard clock and felt my stomach drop. 9:03. I had missed the interview, not just barely, not by a hair, completely. The kind of late that didn't deserve an explanation. The kind of late that closed doors with finality. A hollow feeling spread through my chest, slow and heavy, as if all the air had been pushed out of the world. I gripped the steering wheel, my thumb tracing the cracked leather, and tried to swallow the tightness building in my throat. For a moment, I let my head fall back against the seat, the ceiling of the truck blurry above me. I had known this might happen the moment I stopped, but knowing it didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. I pulled back onto the highway out of habit more than intention, my mind numb as the road stretched ahead of me. Claire had driven off moments earlier, her taillights merging into the faded gray morning. I didn't blame her for leaving quickly. If I were her, I might have done the same. I passed the exit I should have taken for the interview building and watched it disappear in my rearview mirror, a small rectangular sign swallowed by distance. The ache in my chest deepened. I tried telling myself that maybe the interviewers would understand, that maybe they would give me another chance, but the thought was hollow. Companies didn't wait for men like me. They didn't offer do-overs. They barely offered chances in the first place. When I finally reached my apartment complex, the parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few old sedans and a pickup missing its tailgate. I parked in my usual spot and shut off the engine, letting the silence sit heavy around me. I didn't get out right away. I couldn't. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the cold seep into my palms. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield, dimming the world outside until everything looked like a fading photograph. Eventually, I stepped out and walked toward the building, my shoulders slumped. The air smelled faintly of frost and the lingering scent of someone's cigarette from earlier that morning. Each step felt heavier than the last as I climbed the stairs to our apartment. Inside, the familiar creak of the door sounded louder than usual. Emma sat cross-legged at the small kitchen table, coloring in a workbook. The moment she looked up and saw me still wearing my tie, her face lit up with a hopeful smile. "You're back early," she said, her voice bright. "Did it go good?" I closed the door behind me, setting my keys quietly on the counter. I could have lied. I could have forced a smile and said it went fine, that everything was okay, that I had walked into that building and impressed the people in charge. But I had made enough promises in life that I couldn't keep. I didn't want to add another one. I walked over and sat down in the chair across from her, loosening my tie, because it suddenly felt too tight. "I missed it, sweetheart." The words felt heavy, leaving my mouth like stones. Emma's smile faded slowly, her eyes narrowing with worry. "You missed it," she echoed softly. I nodded, rubbing my palms together for warmth. I stopped to help someone on the road, and by the time I finished, it was too late. She studied me for a long moment, the kind of deep, searching look only children seem capable of. There was no anger in her face, no frustration, only quiet disappointment mixed with something like understanding. You always help people, she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom said you were like that even before I was born. I lowered my head, guilt thrumming in my chest. Her small hand reached across the table and touched mine. Dad, she said softly, even if you missed it, I'm still proud of you. That hit harder than any rejection ever could. I forced a smile that was more heartbreak than happiness. Life had a way of reminding you of your limits, and today it felt like I had slammed into mine at full speed. I didn't know then that the cost of my choice wasn't as final as it felt. All I knew was the sting of failure settling deep in my bones as I sat across from the little girl I was trying so hard to give a better life. The afternoon slipped by slowly. The kind of slow that makes every noise feel louder and every thought feel heavier. I tried to keep myself busy, washed the few dishes in the sink, swept the kitchen floor, tightened a loose cabinet hinge that had been bothering me for weeks. But no matter what I did, the weight of the morning hung over me like a damp coat I couldn't shrug off. Emma moved quietly through the apartment, humming sometimes, drawing sometimes, but always glancing at me with that cautious awareness only children who have lived through too much seem to acquire too early. By the time evening settled in the sky outside our living room window had turned a deep blue-gray, the kind that comes with winter nights that arrive sooner than you expect. I heated up a pot of canned soup, stirring it absent-mindedly, while Emma set the table with two mismatched bowls and a spoon that had lost most of its silver finish. When we sat down to eat, neither of us spoke at first. The apartment felt too still, too fragile. The only sound was the faint clinking of Emma's spoon tapping against her bowl and the soft hum of the old refrigerator struggling to keep itself alive. I took a bite of the soup, but it tasted like nothing. My thoughts kept circling the same painful loop. I had missed the interview. I had failed again, and not just for myself, but for her. My daughter glanced up at me, her eyes reflecting the dim overhead light. Dad, are you sad? She asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to form words. I don't know if sad is the right word, I said finally. Maybe disappointed, maybe tired. She looked down at her soup, tracing tiny circles with her spoon. It's okay to be sad, she murmured. Everybody gets sad. Never had a sentence been so gentle and yet so sharp at the same time. I forced a small smile. You're right. She nodded thoughtfully, then added, but it's not your fault, you know. You helped someone. That's what good people do. Something inside me went still. I couldn't speak at first because hearing her say those words so simple, so unguarded, felt like someone had held a mirror up to me, showing me a version of myself I had forgotten how to see. A version that wasn't a failure, wasn't always behind, wasn't defined by missed chances and threadbare shirts and bills stacked on the counter. The version of me she believed in. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words settle into the cracks inside me. Do you really think so? I asked quietly. She blinked at me with that earnest expression children have before the world teaches them how to doubt themselves. Yeah, I do, she said. Mom used to say you were the kind of person who helps even when it's hard, even when nobody knows, even when it costs you. I felt the sting of tears press against the back of my eyes, the kind you try to blink away because you think you have to be the strong one. But Emma kept talking, her voice soft but steady. She said that made you brave, and brave people don't always get things right, but they always do what's right. I set my spoon down and looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she kept trying to reassure me even though she was just a child. It struck me then how much she had grown, how much she had learned from the struggles we had faced, and how much she still believed in the core of who I was. And in that quiet kitchen with the sound of wind brushing against the windows and the warmth of the stove still lingering in the air, something inside me shifted. The disappointment didn't disappear, but it softened around the edges. Emma didn't see my worth in job titles or paychecks or whether I made it to an interview on time. She saw it in the choices I made, the ones that mattered. I reached across the table and squeezed her small hand, grateful beyond words. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice low. "You always know what to say." She grinned, the sadness that had lingered in her eyes melting away. "That's what daughters are for." I laughed under my breath, the sound loosening the tightness in my chest. And for the first time that day, the heavy fog of failure lifted enough for me to breathe again. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how we would move forward, but in that moment, with Emma's hand in mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And sometimes hope is enough to keep you standing. The next morning began like any other, with the alarm buzzing far earlier than my body wanted it to. I rolled out of bed quietly so I wouldn't wake Emma, pulled on my work boots, and brewed a pot of coffee that tasted more like burnt dirt than anything caffeinated. The emotional weight from the day before lingered, stretching across my shoulders like an old familiar coat, but I tried to push it aside. People like me didn't have the luxury of dwelling on disappointment. The world didn't stop because your heart felt heavy. By 7, I was at the repair shop where I worked part-time, a cramped building with peeling paint and a sign that buzzed whenever the wind hit it right. I stepped inside, the smell of oil and rubber greeting me like a worn-out friend. My boss, Earl, was hunched over an invoice, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Morning, Ryan," he grumbled without looking up. "Busy day." I nodded and grabbed a rag, wiping down a workbench that hadn't been cleaned since before I started there. My mind wandered despite my best efforts. Every now and then, the memory of the interview flickered across my thoughts like a dying light bulb. The sense of loss came with it, sharp and undeniable. By 8, I had thrown myself into work, the steady rhythm of tightening bolts and diagnosing sputtering engines pulling me into a familiar flow. Work had always been the one place I felt capable, even when the rest of my life felt uncertain. I was elbow-deep in the guts of an old Honda when the bell over the shop door chimed. Earl yelled from across the room. Someone up front. Probably another inspection or a tire rotation. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped out into the small waiting area, and froze. Standing there holding 2 cups of coffee was the woman from the highway. Claire. Her hair was neatly brushed this time, falling softly around her shoulders. She wore a simple sweater and dark jeans instead of the professional clothes from yesterday, and without the wind whipping at her face, she looked almost like someone from a different world than the one I had met on the road. She smiled when she saw me, that same small, grateful smile from before, though there was something else in her eyes now, something I couldn't read. "Morning, Ryan," she said. The sound of my name in her voice jolted me in a way I hadn't expected. "Claire," I said slowly, trying to piece together how or why she had found me. What are you doing here?" She held out one of the coffees. "Thought you might need this." I took it automatically, the warmth seeping into my stiff fingers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Earl looked up from behind the counter, eyebrows raised. "Friend of yours?" he asked loudly. I cleared my throat. Something like that. Claire waited until he walked into the back room before letting out a breath. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Yesterday." "Well, you didn't have to stop. Most people wouldn't have." I shrugged, feeling awkward under her steady gaze. It was the right thing to do. She studied me for a long moment, then glanced at the tools scattered on the nearby bench. "So, this is where you work," I nodded. "Part-time. Makes ends meet. Barely." She ran a finger along the rim of her coffee cup, her expression thoughtful. "You mentioned the interview yesterday. Did you—" I shook my head. "No, I didn't make it." Her face fell, the guilt hitting her so visibly it felt almost painful to witness. "Ryan, I am so sorry." "Please don't be," I said quickly. "You didn't choose for your tire to blow." "Life happens." She hesitated, as if fighting an internal battle. Then she asked quietly, "If you had the chance to try again, would you?" The question hit me like a punch to the ribs, not just because of what it meant, but because of the way she asked it, careful, deliberate, almost hopeful. "Would I?" I repeated. She nodded. I exhaled slowly, staring at the concrete floor for a moment. "I would?" I said finally. "I really would." Something in her posture eased, like tension winding out of her one breath at a time. "Good," she said. "That's good to know." Before I could ask what she meant, Earl's voice boomed from the back again. "Carter, need you to look at this alternator." I glanced over my shoulder. "Give me a sec." I called, then turned back to her, but Claire was already stepping toward the door. "I should let you work," she said. "Thank you again for everything." She paused with her hand on the door, her gaze catching mine with an intensity that made my pulse thrum. "And Ryan, don't give up just yet. You never know what's coming." Then she was gone, the bell chiming softly behind her. I stood there for a long moment, coffee warming my hands, confusion tightening in my chest. I didn't know who she really was. I didn't know why she came. But as the bell's echo faded, one thing became clear. Yesterday wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of engine smoke and the steady clang of tools against metal, but my mind wasn't in the shop anymore. It was still replaying Claire's visit, the way she had looked at me, the careful tone in her voice when she asked whether I'd try again if given another chance. Those words stuck with me like a hook lodged under my ribs. Every so often I'd catch myself glancing toward the front door, half expecting her to walk back in and explain what she meant. She didn't. By lunchtime I had convinced myself I was reading too much into everything. People say things to be kind. They try to ease guilt. They offer comfort they can't follow through on. I'd learned a long time ago not to expect anything more than what was plainly in front of me. So, when the shop phone rang around 1 o'clock and Earl bellowed my name from across the garage, I didn't think much of it. Probably another customer asking for a quote or someone looking for their car ahead of schedule. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked toward the counter, calling out, "This is Ryan." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and absolutely unfamiliar. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hale. This is Kimberly from the HR department at Northway Manufacturing." I froze. For a moment, the background noise of the shop disappeared. My heartbeat thumped hard in my ears. HR, Northway Manufacturing. I swallowed. "Yes, this is him. We're calling regarding your interview yesterday," she continued smoothly. "Our team understands you experienced unexpected car trouble and were unable to make your scheduled time." I blinked. Car trouble. That was the phrase. The exact one that made my pulse jump. I had never mentioned car trouble to anyone, certainly not to the company. My voice came out rough. Yes, that's correct. We would like to offer you a second interview slot," she said. "Tomorrow morning at 9, if that works for you." For several seconds I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to narrow around me, collapsing into a single spinning question. How did they know? The only explanation sat like a bright, undeniable flare in my mind. Claire. Whatever her reason, whatever her connection, she had gone out of her way to fix what I had broken by stopping to help her. I finally managed to respond. "Yes, absolutely. I can be there." "Wonderful," she said. "We look forward to meeting you, Mr. Hale." She hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there with the receiver still pressed to my ear, my hand trembling slightly. Earl looked up from across the counter. "Problem." I shook my head slowly, a stunned laugh escaping my throat. No problem at all. For the first time in a long time, hope flickered inside me, small but bright enough to warm the cold edges of my doubt. I didn't know why Claire had helped me or what she wanted or how she fit into any of this. But something told me this wasn't coincidence. This was something bigger, something moving beneath the surface of an ordinary life. And as I walked back into the garage, heart still racing, I realized something else. Tomorrow, everything could change again. I arrived at Northway Manufacturing the next morning with my nerves wound so tight I could feel every heartbeat in my throat. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind that hinted at cold without fully committing, and as I pulled into the parking lot, the building's glass facade reflected the morning light like a wall of polished ice. I smoothed my shirt for the third time, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled. This was my second chance, a miracle I didn't understand and wasn't sure I deserved, but I intended to handle it with every ounce of dignity I had left. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet efficiency. The receptionist greeted me warmly, as if she had already been told to expect me, and that alone sent a strange ripple through my chest. After a few minutes, an HR representative appeared and led me through a corridor lined with framed photographs of the company's milestones. Each step made my pulse pound harder. We entered a large conference room, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A man in a navy suit stood at the far end of the table, flipping through a folder. He looked up when I entered. "Good morning, Ryan," he said with a polite smile. "I'm David, head of operations. Thank you for coming." I shook his hand firmly, but my attention kept drifting to the empty chair beside him. Someone else was expected. Someone important. David began reviewing my application, asking a few warm-up questions. I tried to focus, but unease prickled down my spine. The second chair stayed empty. I was mid-sentence describing my experience repairing industrial motors when the door behind me opened. I heard footsteps, light but deliberate, and then a voice. Familiar. Calm. Controlled. "Good morning, gentlemen." I turned, and the world tilted. Claire stood in the doorway, but not the Claire from the highway. Not the Claire who shivered in the cold beside a crippled SUV. This Claire wore a charcoal blazer tailored perfectly with her hair pulled back in a sleek twist. Her expression was composed, confident, every inch of her radiating authority. She wasn't Claire. She was someone else entirely. David straightened. "Morning, Ms. Whitford." Ms. Whitford. The name slammed into me with dizzying force. I had read that name dozens of times while researching the company. Northway Manufacturing's CEO, the youngest executive the company had ever appointed. A powerhouse known for turning struggling facilities around with relentless focus and unexpected compassion. I stared at her, my thoughts scattering like loose bolts across a workshop floor. She met my gaze with the faintest trace of something soft. Regret, maybe, or understanding, before she took her seat beside David. "Thank you for joining us," she said to me, her voice steady. I forced myself to breathe, though every inhale felt shallow. "You're the CEO?" I said slowly, each word stiff with disbelief. She nodded once. "Yes, I am." My mind reeled as pieces of the last 2 days fell into place with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. Her hesitation when giving her name. The careful way she listened to me. Her question about whether I would try again. The HR call. Everything suddenly made terrible perfect sense. David cleared his throat, sensing the tension but trying to keep the interview on track. "Ms. Whitford likes to sit in on certain candidate evaluations. We believe in understanding the whole person, not just the resume." I didn't look at him. My eyes stayed locked on her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She held my gaze without flinching. "Because I needed to know who you were without the weight of my title. I needed to know whether you stopped because it was right, not because of who I am." Her words struck deep, stirring a mix of anger, awe, and something else I couldn't quite name. But before I could respond, David resumed the interview. The questions came quickly, one after another, but my focus was fractured. I answered as best I could, fighting to steady my voice whenever her eyes drifted toward mine. Then came the question I had been dreading. "Why did you miss your first interview?" The room seemed to shrink, the silence drawing tight around us. I turned toward Claire, no Miss Whitford, and spoke plainly. I stopped to help someone stranded on the highway, someone who needed me, and that mattered more in that moment than showing up on time. Her face didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her eyes like a quiet acknowledgement passing through them. David nodded slowly. "That's unexpected." I shrugged lightly. "Maybe, but I don't regret it." The room fell silent again, not heavy this time, but charged as if something important had been set in motion. For the first time since walking through those glass doors, I felt a steadiness return to me. My dignity. My truth. And the undeniable realization that this interview, this woman, this moment, were about to change the course of my life in ways I never could have predicted. The interview was still in progress when a sharp knock rattled the conference room door. A man in a gray work vest stepped in without waiting for permission, his expression tense, his breath a little quick as if he'd jogged down the hallway. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, glancing between David and Ms. Whitford, "but we've got a situation in Plant 3. Line 7 just went down. Production's at a standstill." David straightened immediately, his polite executive calm slipping. "What happened?" The supervisor shook his head. "We're not sure. Sensors are tripping, the conveyor stopped dead, and maintenance can't pinpoint the failure. We've already lost an hour, in a place like this that was thousands of dollars sliding straight into the void. Maybe tens of thousands." I saw the flicker of frustration cross David's face, but it was the look on Claire's on Ms. Whitford's face that caught my attention. Not anger, not panic, just focus. A deep, sharp focus that made the room feel smaller. She rose from her chair. "Let's go." The three of them turned toward the door, already speaking in clipped technical fragments. I sat still for half a second, heart pounding. This was their crisis, not mine. Their plant, not my responsibility. I had no right to follow, but something inside me refused to stay seated. Maybe pride, maybe instinct. Maybe the unwavering truth that machines speak the same language everywhere and I knew their dialect better than most. I stood. "If you don't mind," I said, "I'd like to come with you." All three turned toward me. David looked confused. The supervisor looked skeptical, but Claire's expression, hers, was something else. Not surprise, not hesitation, almost like she had been waiting for me to say exactly that. She gave a tight nod. "All right, come." We moved quickly through the wide industrial corridors, the hum of machinery growing louder until we reached the entrance to Plant 3. The moment we stepped inside, the tension hit like a physical wall. Workers stood clustered in uneasy groups, supervisors barked into radios, and Line 7 loomed ahead of us, silent, frozen, its conveyor belt unmoving like a dead vein in an otherwise living creature. A tall engineer approached with a tablet in hand. "We've run diagnostics twice. No voltage irregularities, no primary sensor faults. We replaced 2 relays just in case, but still nothing." Claire nodded, calm but firm. "What about the pressure valves?" "Checked. Green across the board, hydraulic levels." "Normal." I stepped forward cautiously, not wanting to overstep but unable to ignore the glaring signs of a deeper issue. "Has anyone looked at the secondary pressure trip?" The room went quiet for a moment. The engineer frowned. "Secondary trip?" He tapped rapidly on his tablet. "There's no alert for it. It won't throw a digital alert," I said. "On this model, the secondary trip is mechanical. It doesn't report to the system. You have to inspect it manually." The engineer blinked. David turned toward me slowly. "And Claire?" She didn't move, but something sparked in her eyes. Not shock, recognition, quiet approval. The supervisor pointed toward the machine. "It's behind the auxiliary guard panel, right?" I nodded. "Do you have a socket wrench and a flashlight?" Someone scrambled to fetch them. Within seconds, tools were placed in my hands. I crouched at the base of the conveyor, slipping the socket onto the bolts. The guard panel came loose with a clatter, and a wave of warm, stale air rushed out. I reached inside, fingers navigating the tangle of pipes and metal. The noise of the plant seemed to fade as I focused entirely on the machine's heartbeat. When I found the secondary pressure trip, my breath caught. There it is. A tiny component, no bigger than my thumb, jammed with debris and seized halfway through its reset cycle. A mechanical failure invisible to digital diagnostics. I looked up. "This is your culprit." I worked quickly, clearing the debris, lubricating the stuck mechanism, and resetting the trip manually. When I slid out from under the machine, my hands were coated in oil, but my pulse thrummed with a familiar certainty. "Try it now." David gave the signal. Someone hit the restart. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a low hum rippled across the line. The conveyor belt jerked once, twice, then surged back to life, flowing smooth and steady as workers burst into relieved murmurs. A supervisor let out a sharp laugh of disbelief. "I'll be damned." The engineer stared at me like I'd unlocked a secret code. "How did you even know that part existed?" I wiped my hands on a rag. Worked on a similar unit before. This model's failure points aren't obvious unless you've crawled around in the guts of them. David shook his head slowly, a smile spreading. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. But it was Claire's reaction that stunned me the most. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "That machine has stumped 3 of our senior techs," she said quietly. "You diagnosed it in minutes." I didn't know what to say, so I shrugged lightly. Machines talk if you listen. Her expression softened, something almost like pride flashing through her eyes. "You weren't trying to impress us," she said. "You were just doing what needed to be done." I met her gaze steadily. "That's the job, isn't it?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the working plant filled the air, steady, rhythmic, alive again. Then David clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, Ryan, I think we've seen everything we need to see." Claire nodded, her voice calm but unmistakably decisive. "Agreed. Let's head back to the conference room. There's more to discuss." We walked out of the plant together, the hum of the revived line echoing behind us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something powerful take root inside me. Not hope, not luck, something firmer, the sense that I was finally standing where I belonged. When we returned to the conference room, something in the air had shifted. The earlier tension, the uncertainty hovering over every question and answer had been replaced by a quiet understanding that none of us had to say out loud. I took my seat again, still wiping oil from my hands with a rag someone handed me on the way back, and for a moment nobody spoke. David sat forward, folding his hands on the table as he studied me with a new level of respect. "Well, Ryan, I think today showed us exactly who you are." There was no formality in his tone anymore, no polite distance, just sincerity. But it was Claire who held my attention. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softer than I had seen it, yet the sharp edges of her executive composure giving way to something genuine. "You didn't just fix a machine," she said quietly. "You brought an entire floor back to life." I felt my face heat not with embarrassment, but with a deep, grounding sense of recognition. For once, someone saw the work I had spent years doing in small, unseen corners, work that usually only mattered when it failed. She turned to David for a brief moment, then back to me. "We'd like to offer you the position," she said. "Full benefits, competitive salary, and room to grow if you want it." Her wording mattered. Not because of the offer itself, but because it wasn't coded in pity or gratitude. It was given because I had earned it. My voice caught slightly as I replied, "I'd be honored." David shook my hand firmly, but Claire stood as well, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "One more condition," she said, her tone shifting just enough to stir confusion in me. I frowned. "Condition?" She nodded. "I want you to understand something before you accept this role. This company, my company, was built by people like you. People who solve problems quietly, who keep things moving, who don't ask for recognition but deserve it anyway. If you join us, I expect you to keep being that man. Not someone who tries to become what you think we want. Someone who remains exactly who he is." The words hit deeper than she could have known. I nodded slowly. "I can do that. Good," she said, letting out a small breath, "because that's the person I'd trust to help steer this place in the right direction." The meeting ended soon after, but she walked me out to the lobby herself. As we reached the glass doors, the cold morning light stretching across the parking lot, she paused. "Yesterday, on the side of the road, you didn't know who I was," she said. "You didn't care. You just saw someone who needed help. That matters more than you realize." I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. My dad always said that if you only help people when it benefits you, that's not kindness, that's strategy. She smiled, then not the polite, practiced smile of a CEO, but the genuine warmth of someone who understood exactly what I meant. Your father was right. I stepped outside the chill, brushing my cheeks, but I barely felt it. The world looked different now, not brighter, not easier, but clearer. Like someone had wiped fog from a window I didn't realize was dirty. When I pulled into our apartment complex that afternoon, Emma was already waiting by the window. The moment she saw my truck, she burst through the door, racing across the sidewalk with her backpack bouncing behind her. "Dad, Dad, did you get it?" I knelt as she reached me, her small hands gripping my shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart." I set my voice thick with everything the day had carved into me. I got the job. She threw her arms around my neck, laughing into my shirt, and for the first time in years I felt like the ground beneath my feet wasn't shifting, but steady, firm, capable of holding us. That night, over a small dinner we cooked together, Emma asked, "Do you think things will be better now?" I looked at her, then at the worn apartment around us, then back at her again. "Better isn't something that happens all at once," I said. "It's something you build, one choice at a time." She nodded thoughtfully, as if storing the words for later, and in that moment I realized she wasn't just learning from me. I was learning from her, too. That even when the world tests you, even when you feel like you're running out of chances, doing what's right still matters. And sometimes doing what's right brings everything else back around. Stories like this remind us that life rarely rewards us on our schedule. Sometimes the world asks us to choose between what is safe and what is right, between protecting our own interests and protecting our own humanity. But choosing compassion, even when it costs us, shapes who we are far more than any job title or paycheck ever could. Kindness doesn't guarantee success. It doesn't prevent hardship, but it does create a foundation strong enough to carry us through both. When we act with integrity, the world has a way of circling back, of returning what we give in ways we never expect. And in those moments we discover that the real legacy we leave behind is not built on what we achieve, but on who we become.